following program contains unfiltered political discourse and opinions with which you may disagree. If that's not your thing, turn back now. Still here? Well, strap yourself in, folks, because you're about to get shell-shocked. Greetings, denizens of the internet. It is your favorite host, DJ Trump, living rent-free in your heads. Today, George and I will look over the political landscape and bring you our thoughts on the happenings of the day, namely ACB, 11-3, and the GND. So if you want to explain all those acronyms, George, take it away.
Okay, yeah. So the goal here is to discuss three important things. ACB is in Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearings. 11-3 being the election day. We've been told about election week, but I'm going to steadfastly stick to election day, November 3rd. And then the GND being the Green New Deal. So we're going to discuss some analysis of all of those things and developments about them in the upcoming episode. So let's get right down to it.
All right, so Amy Coney Barrett is a bit of a rock star among originalist thinkers, people who believe that the Constitution should be interpreted as it was meant at the time it was written, to the best of our ability to understand that. And that ability is quite great, given the preponderance of documentation we have from the founders specifically on this topic, not least of which is the aforementioned Federalist Papers, which have three of the most influential founding fathers actually, authoring them, primarily, of course, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, with John Jay, who would later go on to be a Supreme Court justice himself. Actually, I think the Chief Justice, if memory serves. So, that's essentially the big point of controversy. For some reason, people think that the Constitution should not be interpreted as it was written, but should be constantly updated without actually going through the process of updating and amending it. And this difference in judicial philosophy is over whether the judiciary is supposed to interpret the law or reinvent the law is a massive political hot-button issue. So Amy Coney Barrett is President Trump's nominee. There's controversy anytime Orange Man does anything, because obviously Orange Man bad. But ACB is almost certainly going to be confirmed. One thing that does kind of grate on me a little bit, and she's been very solid in these hearings so far, is that for most confirmation hearings and for a lot of congressional activity in general, this is just an opportunity for people to get sound bites so that they can show their voters and more often their donors in order to gin up support. So I think that she's a great pick for the court. I think she's incredibly sharp, and I think she's ideologically sound. I just wish the Democrats wouldn't posture so much, but maybe that's a bridge too far for me to wish.
Oh, that is absolutely a bridge too far. There's really not much of a point in wishing that. I'm sorry, DJ Trump, but that's just my read on the facts, at least. I would say that my analysis on the hearings there are a few really, I would say, effective moments that showed who Judge Barrett is and who she might be as a Supreme Court justice, and just also how silly some of the Democrats were and how honest one of them was. I will give one Democrat credit, and I will give that name and that whole anecdote momentarily. So one good thing to note is Judge Barrett got through the hearings with a blank notebook. Of course, the party of the president who appoints a nominee typically throws a lot of softball questions, right? So Senator John Cornyn asked her what was on her notebook, because he noted that most people had notebooks in front of them, and he wanted to know what's on her notebook. What is it that she's using in order to guide her throughout the hearings? And she held up her notebook, and all that was on there was the header the letterhead from the U.S. Senate. It was a blank notebook. She hadn't written any notes. She was doing everything from memory, and I think that that testifies to how prepared she was and how intelligent she is. So she's absolutely fine in terms of her ability to handle tough questions without any help at the moment. I think that
shows comic relief. I think that blank notebook screenshot is just going to be the source of so many excellent memes.
Oh yes, the sort of sassy smile, I think, is really desirable image for Judge Barrett, because it means that, look, I can be a little bit silly about this stuff. I'm enjoying this. I'm not going to sit here and be sad about this hearing. I'm going to make the most of it, enjoy it to the extent that I can, and just show how great I am. That's really what you want in somebody like this, somebody who can handle the spotlight, even as she's probably not going to seek it. That's what you want from somebody who's going through these kinds of rough hearings. The next point I'd like to make is that she explained severability in a very simple way for Americans. So a lot of the left, of course, tried to pretend, oh, well, it didn't matter, it's too easy. But she did explain a concept that most people don't know about and that might be a little bit, it could be very complicated if people didn't understand it correctly. Someone was asking her about it mainly in the context of the Affordable Care Act, but it's a broader principle, and she used the metaphor of Jenga, a Jenga tower. If you take out one or two pieces from the Jenga tower, are you going to topple over the whole thing, or are you going to let it still stand? And that's really the crux of severability. I think that that's something that Judge Barrett deserves significant praise for, because she did such a good job of making it accessible for even kids. I mean, this is something you want your leaders, when possible, to explain things. A corollary that I'll give to this is...
She was a professor of constitutional law, so it's good that she was able to bring that background to bear. And, I mean, she obviously has a great deal of expertise, not only in practicing the law, but in teaching and explaining the law to people who might have confusion.
Yes.
So just to clarify for our audience, many of whom might not also be legal experts, severability is the question of whether a portion of a statute or law can be declared unconstitutional or illegal, or for whatever reason, although that would generally be the reason, not worthy of enforcement, without necessarily gutting the entire law. It's sort of like we'll strike out that paragraph, but the rest stands as it will. And this can sometimes be controversial because typically statutes are interwoven, so one provision will obviously have implications for the other provisions. And that's where the Jenga metaphor comes, because sometimes you can pull out a piece and the rest of the law will still stand, and sometimes you can pull a piece out and the entire thing falls apart.
Okay, absolutely. So yeah, I think that's a very good way of describing it. And I will say that Senator Dianne Feinstein of California actually was willing to compliment Judge Barrett. She said, "Thank you, I'm really impressed. Thank you." So I think, and she got panned by the left for it, obviously. But as much as I don't want to sit here and pretend that I agree with Democrats on most of anything, or that I think most of them are particularly great people, I think Senator Feinstein showed her age, quite frankly. She showed the fact that as an older woman, she remembers when people weren't quite as hateful toward each other. And I think she also specifically is mature enough, unlike a lot of people, even people close to her age in the Senate, to recognize when somebody she may disagree with said something intelligent and worthy of praise. So I think that was a good moment, one of the few positive moments I've seen from Democrats in a very long time, and I would like to give her credit for that one.
Right. I mean, I also need to kind of take this in the negative direction, as one does. DJ Trump, the firebrand, the flamethrower, ironically the moderate in some of our discussions, but not usually. And point out that apparently Dianne Feinstein was also caught on a hot mic talking about Amy Coney Barrett's personal religious beliefs and how they would almost certainly influence her judicial her judicial rulings and analysis. And this, of course, is reminiscent of a previous comment Dianne Feinstein made on the record talking about ACB having the dogma that lived loudly in her.
Oh, yes. I do not mean to sit here and pretend that Senator Feinstein is an overall great person. I just think she did something that no other Democrat was willing to do in this situation. I mean, when you're comparing her to Senator Amy Klobuchar, just making a idiot of herself, Senator Harris attempting to be sassy and failing, as usual, that's not a very high bar to clear, and Senator Feinstein cleared it. I guess that's more my point.
Okay, so we're trying to raise the bar piece by piece in our seemingly degenerating society.
That's fair.
That, but at the same time, you gotta acknowledge the good with the bad. Now, I do think this might be a little bit of a tangent, but it's worth pressing upon. We are obviously a society with a secular government. People's personal religious convictions don't have bearing on the law. The law has bearing on the law. But simultaneously, we're also a society that prides itself on its religious freedom. And it's written originally right in the Constitution that there will be no religious test for any office or public trust in the United States. So it is actually interesting to see that tension play out in the political landscape. Well, on the one hand, we don't want somebody who's going to have their religious views directly influence their behavior as not only as a judge, but as any kind of office holder. But simultaneously, even though we don't want religious doctrine to be enforced by law, obviously people's moral convictions are heavily influenced by what they believe about the nature of the universe, about the nature of ethics. And you don't want to exclude people from the government simply because of their personal convictions. So, and it is interesting to see that play out. The Democrats don't seem to be handling that tension well at all. They just seem to be falling flat on their face.
Well, I was going to say that I think the broader point here is that Barrett, I think, is handling it very deftly. And that brings me to my next point. She cited the Ginsburg rule, which is this idea that you don't want to promise any position on a certain ruling. And I think more specifically, the idea is then Judge Ginsburg, during her Supreme Court confirmation hearings, made the point that she should not make any statements that would indicate too strongly how she would rule in any particular case. Because then it causes multiple problems. One of them being that, you may end up in indicating the image, at least, of a quid pro quo to the person who appointed you, to the president who appointed you, or some senator whose vote your confirmation needed. On the other hand, it could just mean that it makes it sound as though you're too much of a politician in robes rather than someone who's actually willing to look at each individual case on its merits and rule based on those merits. And that bothered a lot of Democrats. They were getting very angry. They thought she was being absolutely cagey and difficult. Both senators and, of course, the peanut gallery commentators. But I think that she was absolutely fair in doing that. I think, in a sense, she honored the late justice's legacy by citing the rule that one of the few things that I think Justice Ginsburg did that was a good thing. I don't think most of what she did was very good. I think, though, that bringing up that rule in her confirmation hearings, it was a good point to make. And I think it's a healthy thing for our government to have that standard for especially Supreme Court nominees.
Right, you got to acknowledge the ups and downs. Her decision in D.C. versus Heller, it got shot down, but very bad. Her decision to withhold specific rulings in a congressional hearing, not only for the reasons you mentioned, but also because it might even lead to some corruption, such as court shopping, although at the Supreme Court that's less of an issue, where you deliberately go to a judge who you know is going to rule a certain way, or it might even interfere in a case where the judge is trying to make a fair and reasonable opinion, and if they've given this commitment to a case ruling that's not justified in the given case, that puts them in a bit of a bind. There's so many reasons why it's a bad idea to try and get a priori decisions that, Ginsburg's observation, which has been standard practice for every, not just Supreme Court justice, but any contested justice under any circumstances really, has been a judge, I should say. Justice is reserved, of course, for the highest court in the land, technically. But beyond that, it is just standard practice because it's just such a good rule. And it also gets you out of some tough political spots, to be fair. So, I think that it's completely fair for Amy Coney Barrett to follow the precedent of all of her immediate predecessors, of whom RBG was the most direct in summation of that principle. And perhaps, if not the first, one of the first, I believe.
Yes, absolutely. And I'd like to move on to one other big thing that she did, and then followed by a couple of technical items about her confirmation. But the last big sort of event throughout the confirmation hearing process, and one of the important principles that Judge Barrett, I think, very well handled, was the idea of super precedent. So super precedent applies to probably a handful of cases decided by the Supreme Court that are considered both to be solidly legally decided, as in the legal profession across the entire legal community pretty well believes that they were decided correctly and that they don't have any major logical vulnerabilities, and also that the American people widely have accepted their validity. So Brown versus Board of Education is a perfect example of a super precedent. No one's going to try to overturn that. There are very, very few, if any, legal scholars who believe it was decided wrongly. And the American people very much buy into the idea that separate is inherently unequal. And that's effectively one of the strong phrases from Brown versus Board. Now, she also argued that Roe versus Wade was not super precedent, but then she refused to say how she would rule on it. Now, I think that is a perfect example of how to handle the um, the issue of trying to be asked to give indications of how one would rule, but on the other hand, being willing to make obvious statements of accepted legal analysis. For example, that Roe versus Wade, because it's controversial, still is not super precedent. Now, one, I will note that even many legal scholars, even leftist legal scholars, some of them reject the reasoning. They think that it invented a right to privacy that didn't exist in the Constitution, and that there are other ways to find that kind of right to an abortion. Or some of them don't think is a right to an abortion, that we need to pass an amendment to make such a right. And then, of course, there are the people who believe abortion's wrong anyway, many of whom believe that this case also just doesn't make legal sense either. But also, one more thing I will note is that she pointed out that if it were super precedent, she wouldn't be asked about it. Nobody would be asking her this question because it would not be such a hot button issue. The fact that it's a hot button issue means it's not a super precedent. So that, I think, is something that Judge Barrett handled very well, and the Democrats fumbled as usual. I just hope that it hits them in the ballot. You know, what do they say? Grab them by the ballot? I hope that we can do that and with things like this super precedent silliness.
Right. I would also encourage everyone to look up the early voting dates in your state if you don't want to go on election day because of long lines or scheduling conflicts. Or if you're more of an election day kind of guy or gal, lad or lass, or lad or lady, I should say. That's actually more and amusing. But in any case, yeah, go vote. This is a political show. We can say that. And we can also tell you how to vote. So continue to listen for our sage advice to anybody who might be on the fence just listening to this program by DJ Trump.
Yep. Okay. So last things I'll note. The confirmation vote is scheduled on Thursday, October 22nd. It is actually delayed for a whole week based on Senate rules because the senator asked for it to be delayed a week. And the Republicans, despite accusations, are actually following standard procedure, at least, and are following the rules that the Senate usually has for confirmation hearings. So that's expected to be coming up this week. And the probable outcome that is Georgia's prediction, at least, if maybe not my colleague DJ Trump's prediction, is a 51-49 confirmation vote. I believe that all Democrats are going to vote against Barrett, and that Collins and Murkowski are going to vote against.
You repeat yourself.
Oh, okay, yes, that is a fair point. They are Senators Collins and Murkowski are, in many ways, more Democrat than Republican, but I believe that all of them are going to be voting against, and that counts up to 49. I believe that all 51 Republicans are going to go vote, or 51 remaining Republicans are going to vote for confirmation, because one of the usual troublemakers, Romney, seems to be comfortable with Barrett. So
he may be comfortable, but I don't trust Mittens.
I don't trust Mittens, to be very clear, but it appears to me that he seems to think it's in his interests. Or, because remember, Mittens is all about feelings. I mean, he's Mormon. Like, Mormons are all about feelings. So,
shout out to all the based Mormons. We know some of you must exist statistically.
Yes, but I think that...
I also took the Book of Mormon really well, just in general. Let's be nice a little bit.
Okay, yeah, to be fair. Okay, in any case, I think Mittens particularly... I mean, Senator Mike Lee is an example of a Mormon who maybe doesn't have as much of a touchy-feely persona, but Mittens has strong feelings, but it appears that his feelings align with Barrett. Anyway, we don't need him. If it's 50-50, then Pence can break a tie, but I think...
Question, how is Pierre Delecto going to vote?
Okay, that is a good point. I think we'll move on, though. I don't think we need to hear any more about Pierre Delecto, honestly.
We can afford to lose him because we still would have 50 senators.
Yeah, we still have electric Pence to break the tie, which would be pretty awesome.
That's on Mike, yeah.
Yep. Anyway, so next topic, we're going to talk about some corruption from our Democratic presidential nominee, Biden, and then also some Twitter censorship of any of this coverage of Joe and Hunter Biden's little misadventures. So I can start on this. Burisma is a Ukrainian oil and gas company, and as we all know, Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, had a $50,000 a month board position at Burisma, despite not having any experience in any related industry and not apparently adding a whole lot. So granted, keep in mind that
Canadian either. He didn't speak the language.
Yeah, he didn't even speak Russian.
He'd been discharged from, I believe it was the Navy. I could be mistaken on that. One of the military branches. I believe, for testing positive in a drug test with regards to the cocaine, which is going to come back up again.
Yep, and basically, the number 3 for Burisma is by the name of Vadim Podjarsky, and he sent an email on April 17th of 2015 saying, "Dear Hunter, thank you for inviting me to DC and giving me an opportunity to meet your father and spend some time together. It's realty an honor and a pleasure." So obviously he made some errors, but that's not the point. The point is that Hunter Biden introduced this Vadim Podjarsky to Joe Biden when he was vice president. And this was in a New York Post article that was labeled a smoking gun, and indeed it is. And then even worse, there was another email that was reported on in this article in 2014 that was asking for, quote, advice on how you could use your influence. And this was Vadim asking Hunter this, clearly looking to take advantage of Hunter's father's position as vice president in order to advance Burisma's interests. And I think that that's a really important point to make here because the Biden family, and you can look up, there's a great book. It's called Profiles in Corruption by Peter Schweitzer. It describes a lot of Democrats' corruption, including Biden. And it's important to look at particularly the Burisma deals with Hunter and just his general corruption using his father's name. So I think it's important to discuss the fact that all that stuff was found on a computer, and then also that it was censored. Because it was found, Biden had claimed that he had, quote, never spoken to his son about his overseas business dealings, but then when this was disproven, because we see that there were meetings and there were interactions relating to his business dealings with Biden, Twitter withdrew the New York Post's access to its own Twitter for posting its own article about this. And even though they changed the rules later because of an outcry, they still won't give back access to the New York Post until they take down all the tweets that have links to that article.
Right, so this isn't election interference in any way. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Remember that President Trump was impeached for wanting to look into this completely innocuous situation, and that Biden and the Biden family have no corrupt ties in Ukraine whatsoever. And, ignorance is strength, slavery is freedom, war is peace. Big Brother is watching you.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's basically what we appear to be seeing here. I would also note that there's basically it's very clear that the president was wanted to investigate the whole firing of a certain prosecutor in the Ukraine, and this prosecutor had actually been investigating Burisma, and at that time Vice President Biden made sure that he got fired. This prosecutor was by the name of Viktor Shokin. He was the prosecutor general, and you can hear how Biden addressed this issue when Shokin was investigating Burisma. So he said, and I quote, "I looked at them and said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor is not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch, he got fired." Those were Biden's words. This was withholding of a $1 billion U.S. loan guarantee during a 2015 trip to Kiev in December of 2015 specifically. I mean, basically, this is the most obvious kind of interference on his son's business's behalf. This is absolutely indefensible. But of course, Twitter not only did not tried to take the tweets down and blocked the New York Post, but even after they changed the rules, they said the New York Post has to take those tweets down before they can ever get back into their account.
Right. So, let's try and give the devil its due and be as generous as is possible, which is not deserved, but would still illustrate some helpful points. Let's assume, because a lot of people have brought this up, that Shokin was actually under some cloud of inspector of corruption himself, which has been a point that's been made, although it's been disputed. The standard for most U.S. officials, and certainly for officials at the highest level, is to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. And And obviously, having your son working at an energy company in Ukraine that is under investigation by a prosecutor that you are now trying to fire has a massive appearance of impropriety, even if you have legitimate reason to do so. So, I mean, obviously, they should have taken that into account. Biden probably shouldn't have been front man. And if he was the front man, he should have recused himself from anything that might have been related to his son's businesses. Furthermore, even if you are one of the believers at Twitter and you think, well, I think that, this whole story is nonsense, it's fake, it's all smoke and mirrors instead of a smoking gun, wouldn't you rather live in a society where people were able to sniff out BS on their own? I mean, why does Twitter get to decide what we see and what we don't see? Why can't we just spot nonsense if it's actual nonsense, or see what the truth is if it's the actual truth? Why do we have to have that curated for us by Silicon Valley elites?
That is an absolutely fair point, and I can't agree more. Okay, so last thing I will note is all of these emails came from a laptop that was dropped off at this weird, I guess it was like a computer repair store in Delaware. I mean, it was a very weird situation. I don't know what whoever did this was thinking, but I mean, this reminds me a lot of the the Anthony Weiner laptop issue.
Yeah. I mean, what is it about Democratic nominees for the presidency? I guess if you were going to be a little bit more general, what is it about powerful people in general that they're always like 1 degree of separation from a total moron?
Yeah, I don't even really know how to answer that question. But there was actually a federal subpoena that's in our video in Delaware that basically subpoenaed the hard drive and the computer because there was a hard drive that actually had copies of all the files on the computer. And you can see that this was considered very serious information and a serious potential problem. So if the FBI, which has pretty well demonstrated an anti-Trump bias and an anti-Republican bias in general, at least recently, considered this important, I think we need to note that there was a problem here. There was something really worth investigating, and the fact that they tried to impeach Trump over investigating this stuff is pathetic. I mean, it's just sad. It's disgusting. Anyway, I think that we've discussed enough about the corruption itself. We can recommend some more articles in future podcasts, and we may add some links later. But the one other thing I'll note is that this has had an impact on the campaign, and there's just been a more general, interesting trend within the campaign. So the election campaign obviously only has probably a little over 2 weeks left. There's, early voting is open in most states, or is about to open, if not already open. A lot of mail-in ballots have already been returned. Many of those ballots appear to be advantaging Democrats, but that's not a surprise, as a lot of Democrats tend to vote in either by mail or early in person at higher rates than Republicans usually, and this year it's exaggerated because of the partisan issue around mail-in versus in-person voting and the differing levels of trust in the mail. So right now I'll give you some updates from some experts. 538 gives Trump a 12% chance of winning the electoral vote and a 4% chance of winning the popular vote. So Real Clear Politics has a 51.3% to 42.4% split between Biden and Trump, respectively, in the national popular vote, and 49.2% to 44.9% in top battlegrounds. So Biden has a pretty formidable advantage. The Biden campaign has its campaign manager putting out a memo saying that it's going to be down to the wire, though. So there is concern on the Democratic side that things are not as they seem. They really think that Trump, I mean, of course they claim it's because of cheating or some conspiracy theories on their end, but for whatever reason, they think that there is a risk for them that Trump still wins, that Trump manages to pull a rabbit out of a hat and wins this election, even though he's behind in the polls, even more so than in 2016, and specifically with fewer undecideds who were critical to him in 2016. So I guess my question to you, DJ Trump, is what is your read of all of this stuff? What do you think is the likely outcome here? And do you believe the polls? Do you believe news coverage? Where do you think the race actually stands?
All right, so this is obviously a massive topic, and I'm going to try and fumble through it best I can. I think in 2016, the polls in many places were actually tighter than they were given credit for. I think even 538 points out that Trump's victory was actually within the margin of error. And then really it was 70,000 votes or so that swung the election one way or the other. So I think at the same time, there were a lot of similar descriptions in the media as to how they think this is going to go. I don't know how much they've corrected for the errors of 2016, at least in their reporting. So I think that Trump is still very much in the game. I think that something close to even odds is probably reasonable. I also think, and this might be relatively uncontroversial, that no matter what happens, there's going to be a massive legal controversy over this because of the eligibility of various mail-in ballots and because of all the last-minute changes to voting legislation and policy in various states as a result of the coronavirus lockdowns and some of the panic surrounding the pandemic. So I think that Trump is still very much in the game. I don't know whether or not he wins for certain, but I think that he and Biden are probably going into this with near even odds. It's probably a lot closer than it's being reported on. I think the polls, if there's a bias, it's almost certainly a bias in Biden's favor. And the way it's being reported on the media is probably even more biased than the data itself because the people in the media are rabidly anti-Trump. Anywhere from 90 to 93% of their coverage is anti-Trump. They want Trump to lose. And they live in areas that are highly Democratic. I mean, especially the big national media in places like D.C. and places like Los Angeles and places like New York City. You don't get more liberal than that, with perhaps the exception of San Francisco. So a lot of their day-to-day interactions and a lot of how they see the world is shaped by profoundly never Trump country. And that's not most of the country. So I suppose we'll see is a thoroughly unsatisfactory answer, but it's the only honest one.
Yeah, I think probably my best assessment myself is that Trump's behind. I don't think there's a lot of dispute on that. I think that the question is how much behind, and the question is what would it take, what needs to change for either Biden to get into blowout territory versus a modest win, or for Trump to flip it and come back from behind. I think that part of it obviously depends on what remains in the news cycle. If this, Twitter censorship, if the collusion between the social media companies, the mainstream media, and the Democrats becomes, an enduring issue for the next couple weeks, I think that could turn out enough people for Trump that could put things back into his camp. I think also there is evidence that a fair number, probably about 10 to 12% of Republicans and independents don't like to answer polls, and that appears to be significantly higher than the number for Democrats, which is more like 4 to 5%. So I think in a lot of coast states, that could really make the difference. Another thing is that bigger than the so-called shy Trump voter effect, which actually, from what I can tell, even with those data, isn't necessarily that big, I think is also the idea that a lot of Trump voters are in rural areas or aren't considered to be active voters, so they're less likely to be reached by pollsters. Now, to an extent, that could also be the case for Democrats because some say that Biden's going to have higher turnout this year than Clinton did because he's less hated. But I think there are a lot of things that could very well break in Trump's favor that could make things a lot closer. The last thing I'll note is the voter registration differential. Trump has basically made significant progress with Republican voter registration in Pennsylvania, Florida. I think North Carolina has had some progress, Arizona, and trying to think of other states because a lot of states don't register by party. So that's why, for example, Wisconsin doesn't have a lot of good information on partisan registration right now. But a lot of those other states, there's been a significant net increase in Republican registration over Democrat registration. So that means that in a close election, that could mean that that's the difference because the Republicans have been registering a lot of voters and Democrats, because of coronavirus, haven't been willing to get out and register voters. And a lot of their voters are afraid to register and do things like that. And
right. I mean, they're at the superior ground game because they're actually on the ground by and large. I think that would be a relatively uncontroversial statement. One other thing I do want to note, and this is relatively anecdotal, so take it with a grain of salt, But I've seen a lot of Telemundo polls that seem to be going very favorably to Trump. Recently, I saw a poll saying that he had like 50% of Hispanics in Florida. And granted, it's Florida, and that tends to have a more highly conservative Hispanic population. In any case, what with the refugees from Cuba and now even Venezuela, who tend to be very anti-communist in their background. But still, during the political debates, the two that have actually happened so far, Telemundo also had a lot of polls indicating that an overwhelmingly large share of the audience of Telemundo, which is a Spanish news outlet, indicated that they thought that Trump and Pence won the debates. So, I mean, usually Republicans get somewhere around 30% of the Hispanic vote, maybe 33%. If the Trump campaign starts getting into the 40s or 50s even, which is probably too optimistic, but maybe low 40s is actually the realm of reasonable possibility, that makes a massive difference on the map.
Oh, yeah, I agree. So one thing I would like to bring up is that I think there's the demographic coalition for each candidate this year, I think is going to be substantially different. So to give you an idea, and I'm using data from the Cook Political Report Swingometer. So according to two-party vote share, and to be clear, what that means is we're ignoring third-party votes, and we're literally just taking the sum, each party's vote share and dividing it by the sum of the two major parties' vote shares in those states. According to two-party vote share in 2016, 69% to 31% was the pro-Trump margin for white non-college voters. White college graduate voters voted for Clinton by 54 to 46%. Black voters voted for Clinton by 92 to 8%. Hispanic voters voted for Clinton by 72 to 28%, and then Asian/other voters voted for Clinton by 73 to 27%. And this is using 2016 exit polls from Edison Research. There have been different exit polls that showed different results, but what I think is going to change is that I actually believe that white college graduates are going to significantly shift against Republicans. I would say it's probably going to be it'll probably be 58 to 42% Democrat for white college grads, and then for blacks, I'm expecting it's going to shift meaningfully in the Republicans' direction. Let's say 12% for Republicans, 88% for Democrats. I think for Latinos, it's probably going to be, I think I see a big shift there. I think it could be more like 67% Democrat, 33% Republican, or even 65-35, I think is what I could see happening if we're lucky. And then Asian and other, I think, since that's such a diverse category, it's hard for me to predict. I do see like somewhat of a shift in Trump's favor, maybe 70-30 rather than 73-27. And then the white college grads, or white non-college grads, I'm just not sure. Because some say, oh, Biden's getting more share of them. But from what I can also tell anecdotally, I have heard that there are a lot of them who stayed home in 2016 who maybe didn't really believe Trump could win, or maybe just didn't really care, and now feel under attack by the left's culture war. So I'm almost inclined to give them, say, a slight shift, say, to 70-30 Republican rather than 69-31. Now, on the electoral map, with the same turnout rates as 2016, because of population changes, that still has Joe Biden winning the Electoral College 279 to 259, basically winning, picking up Nebraska's 2nd District, and then Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan from Trump, and then Trump holding on to everything, not picking up or losing any ground. So in other ground, other than those states. So that's my prediction, and if assuming constant turnout. And it may be a little sympathetic to Republicans, honestly, but that's kind of my view on the demographics. And one more thing, just if I were, say, to adjust for higher turnout among all the different groups, since white college graduates were already at 72%, by far the highest of any group in 2016, I'm going to put them at 75%. I just don't think they have that much room to grow. The rest of them who don't turn out are like already, I don't think they're going to turn out. White college or non-college grads were in the middle of the pack at 55%. So I'm going to say, let's say they go up to like 62%. I think they have a lot more room to grow, and that's still a lot lower. Blacks were at 57%, so let's put them up at like 64 or 63 maybe, just because to adjust for room to grow. Hispanics were at 45. I'll put them up at 52. And then Asians and other were at 46. I'll put them up at 53. And that actually ends up with the same electoral vote margin but it appears that it actually makes some of those decisive states a lot closer. Specifically, it makes Michigan a 0.1% Biden margin, so really a toss-up. It makes Pennsylvania 0.3% and Wisconsin 0.6%. So I think that there's definitely
one of those up. It gets much more competitive. I mean, it could be like worst case scenario 269, but in other cases, he could just win the election flat out.
Yeah. I guess what I'm getting at is I think that there's a lot of room for things to be close, particularly because specifically black voters, even a modest shift among them toward the Republicans, which I think is totally possible, would really make a significant difference because they're disproportionately concentrated in those upper Midwestern swing states and also in Sunbelt swing states like North Carolina, Georgia, Florida. And insofar as people seem to think that Texas is competitive, there are a lot of blacks in Texas. So, I mean, any of these places, having a slightly higher share of the black vote makes a huge difference. And yeah.
So what do you think is the highest reasonable share that the Republicans could get of the black vote? Because I know that the Trump campaign in particular was making a lot of inroads, or at least overtures.
I'd say 85 to 15, or 15% maybe is about as high as I could see it going. And if I shift that to 85-15 and then leave everything else where I thought it was, that ends up flipping Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Nebraska's 2nd District. Nebraska's 2nd District is 0.1% for Trump. Michigan would be 0.7% for Trump, so higher than the last time, actually. And Pennsylvania would be 0.4% for Trump. And then Wisconsin would still be 0.3% for Biden. But that's 296 electoral votes for Trump. And he actually loses the popular vote by a lower margin than he did last time. By about 2.7 million votes or so, and that's less than 2%. So actually, that would be what would happen with these changes in turnout and with my assumptions of changes in vote share.
All right, so let's take a quick break, and when we get back, we're going to talk about the Green New Deal and some other developments in foreign policy, at least briefly. All right, we're back with DJ, Trump, and George, and we're going to talk about some more issues that are a little bit less immediately relevant to the election, but nevertheless are quite important. So we're going to talk about the proposed Green New Deal and some of the economic costs it would impose by comparing it to the analyzed price that we've paid so far around the world to try and increase clean energy production. So I believe, George, you have some of the details on this study you'd like to share?
Okay, so I think one of the interesting things to note here is that there was a study. It was supposed to be pro-Green New Deal, and it's still, or not pro-Green New Deal specifically, but pro-renewable energy, and it's still pretty much eviscerated the effects of renewable energy and of a lot of other supposed green policies, and specifically the breakneck pace at which we're trying to impose them. It effectively one thing that was really funny is that it mentioned that, there was basically a problem with the wildlife impacts. So windmills do kill a lot of rare bats and rare birds. They also, in many cases, change wind patterns and literally affect climate change in the local areas that they are put in. Solar energy is infamous for taking up a lot of space, as is wind energy, so they can affect the wildlife around them seriously and, in fact, destroy a lot of habitat. Another thing with solar panels is that they have this very insidious impact on mining, as do batteries that are required to store renewable energy. They require a lot more mining. They would effectively require massive jumps in the world production of various metals. So I'm going to read a segment for you about this issue. It would be required that we get, quote, just under 2 times the total annual world cobalt production, nearly the entire world production of neodymium, 3/4 of the world's lithium production, and at least half the world's copper production during 2018. If we are to extrapolate this analysis, the current projected estimate of 2 billion cars worldwide, based on 2018 figures, annual production would have to increase for neodymium and dysprosium by 70%. Copper output would need to more than double, and cobalt output would need to increase at least 3.5 times for the entire period from now until 2050 to satisfy the demand.
You see, this is why we need to start mining asteroids, George. This is the future.
Absolutely.
Unironically, I'm in favor of that, but that's not going to get us out of the hole in the short term.
Further, cobalt mining required to make batteries for e-vehicles has severe impacts on the health of women and children in mining communities, where the mining is often done in unregulated, small-scale, artisanal mines. Lithium extraction, also required for manufacturing batteries for e-vehicles, requires large quantities of water and can cause pollution and shortages of fresh water for local communities. So I think the point here is that there are a lot of really potentially negative environmental and human health impacts based on both the manufacturing of the renewable energy generators themselves, and then also the electronic vehicles batteries and other batteries for other devices that would be using the renewable energy. So I think it's very important to take into account the potential impacts of renewable energy and the negative impacts before we sit here and plan to rely on them. I mean, it's just a disastrous potential result.
Right. I mean, I'd like to read some more key statistics and findings from this report. So, since 2010, the Climate Policy Initiative has been publishing annual global landscape of climate finance reports. According to these reports, $3,666 billion US dollars have been spent on global climate change projects over the period of 2011 to 2018. 55% of this expenditure has gone to wind and solar energy. According to World Energy Reports, the contribution of wind and solar to world energy consumption has increased from 0.5% to 3% over this period. Meanwhile, coal, oil, and gas continue to supply 85% of the world's energy consumption, with hydroelectricity and nuclear energy providing most of the remainder. The report's leader, Colleen, I'm probably mispronouncing this, it's an Irish name, Aisada, puts this expenditure in context. It cost the world $2 trillion to increase the share of energy generated by solar wind from 0.5% to 3%. That's actually an underestimate. It cost a $3 trillion, but that's beside the point. So it took us $2 trillion to get the share of energy generated by solar and wind from 0.5% to 3%, and it took us 8 years to do that as well. What would it cost to increase that figure to 100% of our total energy expenditure, and how long would it take to get there? Now, I want to be completely clear on this. I, too, dream of the day when I can have my own off-the-grid homestead with solar panels and an arsenal equivalent to that of a small country. But we have to think pragmatically, especially in the short term. That's expensive. That's difficult. There's the intermittency problem. I mean, solar and wind energy are not always available. The wind is not always blowing. The sun is not always shining. So you need to have strong battery technology, which we don't necessarily have now. Batteries are very expensive. Manufacturing them can create a great deal of pollution. And they just don't store enough power to make this feasible yet. It's getting better all the time. There are a lot of brilliant people who are working on battery technology. And maybe in 10 to 20 years, the free market will have sorted this out and created an incentive structure that really pushes this technology forward. But we don't have it now, and we're not going to have it for the immediate future. So of that remaining energy consumption, hydroelectric is pretty great, but it's also heavily region locked because you have to have a large enough body of moving water to be able to harness that energy in the first place. Geothermal has similar problems. Nuclear is pretty great, except most people aren't cool with having nuclear power plants in their backyard because they fear that Chernobyl might happen or Fukushima might happen. Although, in all honesty, we could be making a much better use of our nuclear option with better plant designs. I mean, potentially with thorium reactors. I know there are a lot of people who are really enthusiastic about that. None of the Green New Deal addresses any of this. I mean, wind is absolutely idiotic. Solar might work, but it still needs some serious development. And in any case, it's still going to be expensive in terms of mining until we can get all the polluting mining activities out into the near Earth orbit, which would be wonderful, but again, is not immediately feasible. Like, there are so many things that need to happen for us to transition from hydrocarbons, and hydrocarbons are the gold standard in this sector for good reason. They're relatively cheap, they're abundant, they can be used at any time. Most countries that have higher investment in solar and wind still have to have a backup grid of hydrocarbons because the hydrocarbons are more reliable, and sometimes the other grid, I don't know if I should call it the primary grid, but the clean grid doesn't always operate at max capacity. So in many parts of Europe, for example, power is more expensive than the United States because not only do they tax a lot of these hydrocarbons, but they also have to maintain two different electric grids in order to keep the entire system running. So there's much more infrastructure. The cost is going up. And nobody ever thinks about these in economic terms. And what really gets me is the increasing availability of electricity is one of the greatest factors in the decline of global poverty. So there are many people who are living in absolute misery, or who were recently living in absolute misery, who are being pulled out of it by the availability of cheap energy. And that is something we need to take very seriously when we try and turn away from these fuels, because these fuels do have their downsides, of course. There's a finite amount of them, although we do keep finding more. Eventually, they're going to run out. They do have some polluting effects. They do seem to have some effect. But they definitely have an effect on the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that seems to have a reasonable correlation, although not a perfect correlation, because there are many other factors involved, with the overall temperature of the planet. Although that effect does seem to be milder than many of the catastrophists are saying. I mean, I think there are some economists who have estimated that we could actually probably take a hit of increasing the global temperature by anything under 2.5 degrees Celsius. I believe you brought this, said to my attention, George, might be cheaper to just deal with it than to try and completely rejigger our energy production sector.
Yes. I remember I heard basically, I read an economic analysis, I forget exactly where it was from, and it basically said that at the cutoff of a 2.5 Celsius increase in temperature from pre-industrial levels, if you go above that, then it makes more sense to focus on, actually trying to minimize the change in climate. But if the change is below that, then it's cheaper actually to address the issues and just live with them than to try to fight them. And it actually is more of an economic benefit just to live with the change than to try to fight it. And 2.5 degrees Celsius, for reference, is about 4.5 Fahrenheit.
Right. So this is one last point I want to make, and I promise we'll move on because we have other stuff that's very important to cover. But the foreign policy impact that the American innovation in energy has had in the last decade or so has been massive, because a lot of the bad actors in the world that we have to deal with base huge amounts of their economy on their energy production. And the United States has been incredibly vulnerable in the past because we consume so much energy. We haven't historically produced as much energy as we've consumed. So Iran has a major oil sector. That's how they get a lot of their government money. Russia has a very large oil and natural gas sector, which gives them a great amount of influence in parts of Europe that are dependent upon Russian oil and gas in order to stay warm in the winter, for example. It's a huge bargaining chip that they have in geopolitical interactions. Venezuela, up until recently, has had their entire government based on the back of their petroleum economy, and they obviously have the largest reserves of petroleum in the world. And the United States being able to sell cheap energy and lower the price has undercut their position in the global market. And that, in addition to just poor management, corruption, and the general failings of socialism and communism, has resulted in the collapse of what was at the time, or what was previously, a mild threat in the region. And I mean, let's not glance over the wider effect in the Middle East. I mean, part of this great reposturing in the Middle East right now is because OPEC and many of its allies, I mean, not all of whom are Middle Eastern, but many of whom are, have to consider the fact that now the United States is not in nearly as weak of a position negotiating-wise as it was before. They can't, like they did in the 70s, cut our oil supply and expect to shut down our economy. And that gives us more flexibility in negotiations. We have a stronger position at the bargaining table. Saudi Arabia in particular is trying to move its economy away from pure petroleum production in order to diversify, and that means that they have to liberalize great amounts of their society in order to make it a more attractive place for people of other professions to live. This might also even have some, I don't want to say orthogonal, but tangential might be the better word, tangential effect on relations with Israel and other governments in the Middle East that have generally been strained with the major oil-producing countries, because Israel has a lot of technical expertise and they have access to a lot of the things that a more sophisticated economy would need. So it's this economic shift that is largely a result of America's growth in independent energy production has had massive effects on the power balance in the region, normally in the favor of America and its allies and free democratic countries. And nobody on the left cares about this. Nobody cares that the American economy is producing more energy than it consumes now under President Trump, which is unprecedented in recent history. Nobody cares that it's weakening the foreign adversaries that they seem to be so concerned about, nobody ever mentions in any context for some reason just the insanity of what Trump and Kushner have been able to pull off in the Middle East, bringing several Arab powers to the table with Israel to normalize relations. That's incredible. And in essence, people who are promoting a lot of this Green New Deal stuff, they don't care that the science doesn't work very well. They don't care that it's expensive and it's going to make a lot more people in the world poor and miserable, not just the affluent countries, but the poorer countries, if they have the ability to affect it. They don't seem to much care that the effect on the environment is not going to be that great unless they completely gut the global economy. And they don't care about America's status on the foreign stage. So that's my energy rant, folks. DJ Trump is going to step back and move on now.
Yeah, I think that I agree with pretty much all of what DJ Trump has said, and I think that it is important just to consider the implications of this and the limited impact on the environmental, situation, short of catastrophic, massive suffering-inducing changes, which I think are not worth the trouble, as we discussed earlier. A couple more topics we're going to discuss. One is that a jihadist student beheaded a French teacher. Really disgusting. I mean, I don't even know how to respond to this. The fact that this keeps happening in France, that, all these so-called refugees, all these Muslims come in and cause all kinds of trouble, kill all kinds of French people, kill other Muslims, to be clear as well. They kill people who are of Muslim, Christian, or atheist backgrounds in France, Jews as well. I mean, they basically appear to be a scourge on the country of France, and I just don't know what they're going to do about it. I guess that's my question is, where do they go from here? So give us a little background on the situation, DJ Trump.
I mean, it's obviously an incredibly important and an incredibly tense situation. So just to summarize, a history teacher was talking about controversy surrounding the sharing of caricatures and cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in his class. And one of the components of that lecture was actually showing some of the aforementioned controversial cartoons. And as a result of that, an 18-year-old refugee from Chechnya, I should say, he was Chechen, that's the ethnicity, Chechnya is the region. For some reason, they mentioned in the story that he had an airsoft gun, but the actual relevant weapon was a knife. I mean, you can't really kill anyone with an airsoft gun, believe me, I've tried. And in any case, this man was beheaded in the street for giving a history lecture. I don't know if the student in question was actually a student of his. At 18, he would have been young enough to be in school, but somehow he found out about the lecture. He didn't approve, and he bragged about his conquest on social media, saying, killed this heretic. This has some precedent. The most obvious would be the Charlie Hebdo shootings, where French cartoonists shared mocking, caricatures of Muhammad and the Islamic religion, and then their office was shot up. And, I mean, France in particular does seem to have a problem with this, but it's not unique. In Europe, for example, an earlier example that comes to mind is the death of Theo van Gogh, another cartoonist and also a maker of a documentary criticizing some Islamic practices in the Netherlands, along with one of his co-contributors, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And he was also murdered in the streets. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali had to flee Europe and now lives in the United States and is under constant protection. She's also, I believe, affiliated with the Hoover Institute, so she still has a reasonably good career, but she's not going back to Europe anytime soon. And, I mean, it is tragic because in a lot of ways, like, France has always prided itself, or not always, but in recent history especially, prided itself on being a country of religious freedom, a country of democracy and freedom of speech. And yet there is a major problem across the Western world, across the world in general, with these Islamic terror attacks, where fundamentalists try to impose their hardline view of the religion on non-believers. And it does generate some outrage. I mean, there are currently, protests that are happening in France right now, which even the prime minister has joined in on, but I don't know if there's going to be any serious policy changes. The Western world really needs to stand up for itself and for its ability to speak freely on issues, on all issues. I mean, religion especially, because, of course, when we aren't allowed to speak freely about religion, things get messy. Most of human history shows that pretty clearly. And I mean, there are a couple drive-by points that we can just make that are relevant. Like, this was a horrible execution that was committed with a knife. And if you look at even crime statistics in the United States, we did a whole special on this previously. You can check it out. Knives actually kill more people than long guns in this country typically. And it's just, I mean, beyond that, the thing that really gets me the most is that this was done in the middle of the day in broad daylight, like in Paris, like in a major European city. And I don't think it's getting necessarily the attention that it deserves. This is a major problem that we need to deal with, and we're not doing much about it substantively.
Well, I will say the French government has been pretty clear that they're interested in sort of responding to this in a tribute. The question is, are they going to make a policy response? I have one word that I'm going to leave you guys with: Eurabia. Just look up that concept, understand what this might mean for Europe. Is Europe going to be European, or is it going to be overrun by hordes of violent Muslims? I guess to me that's the real question here.
For the sake of basic ecumenical acknowledgement, we do have to point out that overwhelmingly the people who suffer under Sharia law and Islamic regimes and who are overwhelmingly the victims of Islamic violence are in fact other Muslims who might not necessarily toe the party line. And I mean, Islamic culture has a serious problem that it needs to get at. And I mean, I think that's almost impossible to avoid. So, I mean, Europe certainly has to decide whether or not it's going to stand for its tradition of free speech, of, separation of church and state, and for freedom of expression, which are core values of our society, or if it's going to roll over whenever anybody has a problem with anything, particularly if they are considered a historical victim group.
Yes. Okay.
Speaking of conflict between the West and the Islamic world, we're going to segue right into our next geopolitical conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So just to go over this briefly before George goes into more of the details, as is usually the pattern in these sorts of things. In the 1990s, there was a conflict between ethnic Armenians living in the recently independent Republic of Azerbaijan, who had just broken away from the collapsing Soviet Union. And this was caused partially because the Soviets deliberately mixed people of different ethnic groups into the same administrative region. So the Republic of Artsakh, as it is called, broke away from Azerbaijan. It is primarily Armenian, and Armenia is a primarily Christian ethnicity in the Caucasus. And the Azeris still claim that territory. They refer to it as Nagorno-Karabakh. And this led to a brief, maybe not brief exactly, but there was a war in the 1990s, and there was ethnic violence before then. And in 2020, things have been heating up. So in July, there was a series of exchanges. In September and part of October, there's been a series of exchanges between Armenian forces, people from the region of Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh, depending on how you want to refer to it. The international community still recognizes that as legally Azerbaijani territory, but it is de facto controlled by basically a country, although not officially a country, of the Republic of Artsakh. And there's been a hot war going on. It's been getting basically no press coverage. And admittedly, we're only briefly going over it at the end of a segment, but I like to think that we're at least marginally less pathological than the rest of the American media. So I believe it does deserve some attention. And so it's difficult to say exactly how many people have been killed in this war because there are differing reports from each country. Each country generally tends to undersell how many of their own people have been killed and oversell how many of the other people have been killed. Armenia says it's lost 710 servicemen who have been killed and 2 have been captured. The Azerbaijanis say that it's over 6,000 Armenian soldiers who've been killed. The Azeris are not even sharing their casualties, and the Azerbaijanis are saying it's over 2,300. And at the very least, hundreds of civilians have been killed. International journalists have been injured, and 70 to 75,000 people have been displaced. And just as another note, I mean, people have been fired on in their homes. Population centers, civilian population centers have become sources of conflicts and shelling and artillery and drone strikes. It's a messy, messy war that could turn downright genocidal if one side gets the upper hand. And nobody's really talking about it because Orange Man bad, and that's obviously more important. So this is just a reflection of how bad a lot of the foreign policy coverage is. So, George, if you have anything you want to throw into that fire, feel free.
Yeah, I guess I'll make a big point. I guess that Azerbaijan, you can see on the map, is geographically a lot larger and it has a much larger population. However, Armenia punches above its weight in global population. As in ethnic Armenians, there are about, I believe, twice as many ethnic Armenians abroad as in Armenia. And I think they have a lot of resources from that relationship. They also tend to have a decent relationship with Russia, maybe more so than Azerbaijan. And then the religious factor can't be forgotten. Armenia is a staunchly Christian country. It's actually the first country to have become officially Christian in 301 AD. So, granted, that's a very long history of that, and that remains the case today. The Armenian Apostolic Church, which is an Oriental Orthodox Church, remains heavily influential. And then Azerbaijan's a very Muslim country. Another funny thing, Azerbaijan has a lot of co-ethnics who live abroad. There are far more Azeris living in Iran than there are in Azerbaijan. They make up about a quarter of the population, and in fact, some say they're even overrepresented from that share in Iran's government. But that's all just to say that this is going to be an interesting fight, a really bloody one, but just interesting from a geopolitical perspective. Honestly, my money's almost on Armenia just because they've held on so long, but we'll see.
I mean, it's also possible, although I don't know if this is going to hold, that the Russians might have negotiated a successful ceasefire. They have negotiated at least temporary truce, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this war is going to end by any means. And obviously, since these were both Russian satellites at one point, Russia has an immense amount of influence in this region, and they might have an interest in not having two countries very close by their border getting involved in an internecine religious conflict that might kill tens or hundreds of thousands of people. So hopefully they pull through on that one. And I don't always root for the Russians, but when I do, it's to avoid genocide.
Okay, yeah, I think we can agree on that. And to close all this off, I'll discuss a really unfortunate situation, but one that reflects the times. So if you guys all remember the whole fiasco of the Michael Brown shooting and the riots in Ferguson over the false narrative that somehow it was a white cop chasing an innocent black man, which is absolutely not true. However, there was a complicated situation in some ways, and a black scholar by the name of Shelby Steele made a documentary about this. It's called What Killed Michael Brown, and it was blocked by Amazon. They tried to upload it in order to distribute it, and his son, Eli Steele, at first, he and his son thought that there was just a technical difficulty. It was just having trouble uploading, that they couldn't get it to upload to the website. Turns out that Amazon believed that it was too offensive. It was too spicy. It was too difficult for them to handle having that on their website and potentially offending people. So if you think about this for a second, a respected intellectual who happens to be black discussing this issue in a way that incorporates various perspectives and attempts to come to the truth regardless of where that may lead, that's apparently not good enough for Amazon. Apparently Amazon doesn't even think black people love themselves enough to be trusted to post contents on their distribution site. So I think it's just, this is my pitch. You should all watch What Killed Michael Brown. And I downloaded it and I'm about to watch it myself. It's $20. But I think it will be $20 well spent. I think we need to support this kind of investigative work and this kind of historical analysis, because if we don't do it, no one will, and if we don't learn it, no one will, and no one will be able to defend the truth against all of these attacks from the absolutely truth-hating leftists at Amazon and other places. With that, I'll ask DJ Trump for maybe any commentary on this, and then we'll close.
But I think it's a fine idea to watch this and make sure that it gets out and make sure that people know the truth. And above all, that people are able to express themselves freely in our society without penalty. I also am obligated to say that if you want to support true and generally based content, you can continue to watch our show, help get us some of that AdSense. You can also go directly to Anchor, deposit as much money as you want in our account. We do take listener support if you want to. But we will also take your loving adoration and continued subscription. Please like, follow, subscribe on all of our stuff on Twitter, Facebook, whatever podcast outlet you listen to, be it Anchor, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And our YouTube channel you should really check out as well. But please just help us out. All right. I've sufficiently advertised. Anything you want to say, George?
Yeah, I think that I'd just like to remind everyone, please like the video on YouTube. If you can favorite it on Anchor, like our posts on social media. So it's Shellshocked with DJ Trump on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, and that's the same as the name of the YouTube channel, and also our Anchor channel. And then if you can just follow what we've got content coming out every week, 6 p.m. on Mondays. 6 p.m. Central Time, which is 7 p.m. Pacific, or no, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, and 5 p.m. Mountain Time, and then, of course, all around the world, since we have listeners in Europe and South America as well. So with that, I thank you all for listening, and remember, like, subscribe, and share with your friends.
This is DJ Trump signing off.
Yeah, bye from George.